National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, and I'll be serving as the moderator today. I'd like to take a few moments to get everyone oriented to Big Marker. If you haven't used this platform before, you have access to a Q&A, a chat, and those tabs are at the top right of your screen. If you want to minimize them, you click the downward arrow at the upper right corner of the screen. And if you want to bring them back up, you click the blue chat button that's on the bottom right corner. And if you want to view today's presentation in full screen mode, hover over the presentation and click full. If you have any technical issues, please use the private chat function to send a message to NAPC, and we will try to help you out. This session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. As a registrant, you'll be automatically registered to receive the recording a few hours after this session is completed. This program is not eligible for continuing education. This is an opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback today. We do invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function. So go to that Q&A function, type in your question, and then you'll also have an opportunity to see the other questions that people are asking. And if you see something that you really want the answer to, you can upvote it. So give their question a thumbs up, and that'll bring it to the top of the list. So if we're not able to get to all of the questions today, we will prioritize by, based on which ones have gotten the most upvotes. NAPC is committed to providing a welcoming space that encourages collaboration, discussion, and the sharing of ideas and points of view. Note that by attending, you agree to the following code of conduct. Exercise consideration and respect towards presenters and participants in your speech and actions. Attempt collaboration before conflict. Refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in speech. And be mindful of your surroundings and your fellow participants. And now I would like to welcome today's speakers. We have ACHP Chair Sara Bronin and the City of San Antonio's Deputy Historic Preservation Officer, Corey Edwards. And Corey is also the Vice Chair of the NAPC Board of Directors.
Okay, thank you, Abby. Are we good to go?
Yep.
Okay, well, I wanted to kick us off here just with a brief overview, very brief because we only have an hour, but we realize that in many different communities, your engagement in Section 106 process is going to vary. So just to kind of start us out here, one of our charges at the NAPC board is to lead discussions on preservation issues that have impact at the local level. This is one that we believe might impact our local programs. NAPC is an invited observer of the ACHP as well, and we appreciate the opportunity to advocate for local commissions at that federal level. And we, of course, appreciate the time that Chair Bronin has set aside to present this initiative and create a space for a dialogue about what's proposed. So the conversation today is really specific to Section 106. We think it also raises some really good kind of general, broader policy questions. And so we wanted to start by providing this resource, and I think staff will also put a link to this in the chat. But just depending on your comfort level and experience with Section 106, this might be a good primer for you to pull up while this conversation is going on. There is an article in the Alliance Review from a couple years ago that was written by one of our board members that really speaks to the importance of engaging in Section 106 as a local commission. And so we invite all of you to check that out. So just very quickly, what is Section 106? If you're familiar or not, it requires federal agencies to consider the effects of projects for any sort of undertaking. An undertaking by a federal agency is going to be projects on federal property or projects that involve a federal funding source. And so most commonly, what we would see at the local level are things that have a federal funding source. We do know that preservation outcomes are more effective and impactful through local regulations. Section 106, it's important to remember, does not mandate any sort of preservation requirement. What it puts into place is a process for identification of historic resources, notifying stakeholders, and inviting consultation. We of course seek to avoid impacts to historic resources through the Section 106 process, but of course that they cannot be avoided or minimized. We often go into mitigation. And that is a process that local communities often participate in, especially when that project is also subject to local regulations. And I'll explain why in the next slide. But really, it's a place for communication and collaboration with the federal agency regarding the undertaking. So federal agencies must identify potential consulting parties as part of the 106 process. This typically will always include a SHPO, State Historic Preservation Officer, any recognized tribes, local governments, and other kind of interested parties. We have one case here in San Antonio where a registered neighborhood association is participating as a consulting party, and that is sometimes an option. And the agency must invite parties to participate in the consultation, provide basic information about the undertaking so that that meaningful consultation can take place. Generally, what is happening as a consultant is defining the undertaking with an area of potential effects. We're identifying any historic resources within that area of potential effects through either archival research or survey, and making a recommendation as to whether the undertaking has direct or indirect effects to the historic resource. Very often, we are a step along the way as part of our charge as a certified local government and a local commission, local staff. We help that process. And so more often than not, I will concur that there are no known resources. Generally, most undertakings will not impact historic resources, but in other instances, they do. And I have to sometimes clarify either the local designation status or the eligibility for designation. Those consultants are generally access information that's available online or through the State Historic Preservation Office. But sometimes we might have something here locally on file, either a past eligibility review or just information that isn't available online. So that local consultation really is important to identifying those resources on the front end of the undertaking. Another way that local staff and commissions participate is sometimes with the development of mitigation, as I mentioned. And so anytime there's an adverse effect from an undertaking, there's an automatic requirement to coordinate with the ACHP, and all of the consulting parties engage in an MOA where that mitigation is outlined and agreed upon. And so in an instance where local review has been required alongside the Section 106 review, I will incorporate the recommendations from our local commission into that mitigation strategy. So that's just one way that the local process is informing the overall Section 106 review. It's also really important at that time, I like to always communicate on the early end of an undertaking any local requirements that might apply to the project. And so it's always a good way to get that notice, provide the notification that local review is required, and help them to know what to expect as part of that project requirement. And then that's what I just said here in the bold. So again, it's a chance to locate or communicate any local requirements early in the project. Program alternatives are an option for federal agencies for a more streamlined approach to the Section 106 process. This is more common with undertakings that we know are very, very unlikely to impact historic resources or really routine or more of a maintenance project in nature. And so I will let Chair Bronin go into detail about what's proposed and the type of program alternative that's proposed in response to creating accessible, climate resilient, and connected communities. And after that, we will share some concerns that we have at the NAPC level, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So Sarah, did you want to take over from here? And I think if somebody can switch over the slide deck for us, that would be helpful. There we go.
Great. Hi, everybody. So just first of all, I wanted to say that we're really glad to have NAPC as one of the observers to our council. We found their contributions consistently very valuable and looking forward to the conversation. My presentation is just going to start with background, review of the program comment, and inviting feedback. And for those of you who I have not met, I am the chair, the only full-time member of 24 members of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It was confirmed by the Senate a couple of years ago, and I've been in my role since January 2023. But before that, I not only served as the vice chair of the City of Hartford's local Historic Preservation Commission, but I also chaired Preservation Connecticut, and I do, in my day job, which I'm on leave from, research on historic preservation, including a project on local regulation. So you have somebody here in this role who has a lot of familiarity with the local process and local issues, and I think that's why I always am delighted to talk with NAPC. Just by way of background, picking up where Corey left off, Section 106 is that process that requires federal agencies to take into account the effects of their actions on historic properties. Those are National Register properties or properties on or eligible for the National Register. In about a sixth of local commissions across the country, you have reference to the National Register in your local designations, but that is not always the case. Most local commissions don't encompass National Register properties by definition. So you may see, so some of you may see this, some of you may not. But when the 106 comes into play, it usually involves public projects. They could be really big projects like highways or courthouses. They could also be private projects that are receiving federal funding. For the program comment itself, the way that we talk about it as an agency is that it tailors the 106 review process for a group of undertakings or program affecting historic properties, usually when those undertakings, that's the name of the word for the federal government's activities, usually when those undertakings are repetitive in nature, happen again and again, are pretty consistent across jurisdictions, and have known adverse effects. So the goal of this program comment, to use that word, is historic preservation while expanding access to housing, facilitating climate resilient and zero emissions buildings, and promoting climate friendly transportation. So as some of you know, our agency has developed policy statements on housing and climate change that drew from some facts that we know on the ground, including that half of housing units were built before 1979. Buildings and transportation sector emit 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, and buildings use 75% of our electricity generated annually. So just overall, we know that there's a lot going on in the business and transportation sectors, and that frankly, historic properties and historic preservationists can play a really important role in understanding how we can respond to these climate issues and housing issues. So with that, the scope of this program comment is as follows. So it covers all federal housing and all federally funded private housing. It covers federal buildings that are receiving certain types of upgrades, and those are upgrades that make them climate smart buildings, is the name of the category. We also cover through the Section 106 process federal funding of private buildings. So the energy efficiency funding coming through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, $27 billion in that. Any of those dollars that go towards historic buildings would be covered by this program comment. So those are things like electrifying appliances, adding energy efficiency upgrades, and so on. And then the third category is in the category of transportation. So pedestrian, bike, micromobility, and public transit projects, again, across different federal agencies and programs. So just quickly to review the program comment, and there's a lot of technical language in the program comment, but the way that what I wanted to focus on today was these three appendices topics. So the first topic in the appendix are housing projects, housing related undertakings. The second appendix covers undertakings that aim to improve a building's climate resiliency or to improve or to reduce the greenhouse gases emitted by a building. Then the third appendix covers what we've called in our policy statements climate-friendly transportation. And NAPC was involved with providing comments and shaping both the housing and historic preservation policy statement and the climate and historic preservation policy statement. And you'll see concepts from both of those in these documents. So I don't know if somebody might drop the link to the program comment website in the chat in case you might want to follow along or to ask questions based on the document itself. But for those who haven't seen the document yet, I wanted to go through and talk about the framing for Appendix A and then maybe discuss a few of the topics in it. So in terms of housing, Appendix A breaks up the activities into 5 categories. And probably the most important ones are the first 3: site work, building exteriors, building interiors, emergency work, and what we've called other activities. Now, from a local commission standpoint, you're probably most involved with determinations about site work and building exteriors, but I also know that some of you veer into the interiors. So again, the first 2 may be most applicable to this group, but interiors might also be of interest. So when it comes to site work, an example of the kinds of activities that are covered by the program comment include asphalt and concrete surfaces, equipment, fencing, and lighting, being able to be updated if they're on previously disturbed ground. Or there's 2 parts of an appendix, so that's the language in the first part of Appendix A on housing, or in the case of areas where these things might be 50 or 45 years or older, or where there might be some additional disturbed ground, there's a qualified professional that may have to get involved, and that's in Appendix A2. For all of those types of things, so the fencing, the lighting, you can think of it in terms of, for example, a HUD public housing complex, where you might have a playground, where you might have extra amenities that surround the building itself. These activities related to site work are those activities happening in and around a building with housing that is covered by the program comment. So a second activity a second category, that exterior work category, so things that you can, that happen on the building envelope, on the roof, but to the building itself. So an example of an activity that's listed in the program comment are doors, windows, roofing, mechanical systems, and solar energy that are not on the primary facade. Thanks so much for putting that link in the chat. So that is the language in Appendix A, which says that for a building that's historic, you can do certain things as long as they're not on the primary facade and don't have any impacts on the primary facade. In other cases, in Appendix A2, there might be situations where some of that stuff might be able to happen, but only after a qualified professional opines, indicating that there's not an adverse effect on historic properties. As far as interior work, there is wider latitude given in this document to interior work than anywhere else, in part because we heard through the pre-consultation period and also in other consultations, including the discussion that we had on the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, that development was often stymied by review processes that were that housing conversions in particular were stymied by things like reviews of changes to kitchen renovations or bathroom renovations, changes to ceiling heights where you had to install a new mechanical system inside the building with no effects to the exterior. So the language that's proposed in the program comment says that these changes to interior walls and ceilings are okay as long as they're not in primary spaces and don't affect a character-defining feature of a historic building. So these types of things, and so I'll ask you, in your comments, certainly you review the first 2 types of activities, again, site work and exterior, and maybe also interiors. But I would be interested to know how much you review these in a Section 106 context. So not your local commission application, but how much you as commissioners actually review these things. If you're reviewing them routinely with every meeting, great. I'd love to hear what kinds of things you've seen, that might have adverse effects and what might not. If you don't happen to review these as Section 106 referrals from a federal agency, I'd be interested in knowing that too. The process that we are talking about today, the Section 106 process, only affects federal agencies reviewing reviews of their projects. It does not affect your commission's review. It doesn't change your ability to add additional protocols, additional requirements on especially the private developers, which may come under your purview more so than public owners. So just to be very, very clear, this Section 106 process does not supersede local reviews. Moving on to Appendix B, and this is an image. I don't see anybody who said they're from Chicago, but I could have missed it. But if you are from Chicago, if you've been following along, this building is the State Street, built 2 buildings on State Street, the Century and Consumers Building, that were just saved by the Section 106 process, thanks to the careful review by the General Services Administration of the considerations by consulting parties and others that these buildings should not be demolished. So that was a big victory for Section 106. But I include that here because these buildings in downtown Chicago are exactly the kinds of buildings that should be updated for modern purposes that have been neglected for a really long time. And that to find a rehab for these buildings, not only should housing be considered, but also making these buildings as energy efficient as possible should be a priority. So thinking about what we called in the program comment, climate smart buildings, what the program comment would address, again here in 4 broad categories, is site work around buildings that are in the federal inventory like these, or buildings that are receiving federal funding. Activities taking place on the building exterior is the second category, and activities taking place on the building interior is the third big category. And then there are other activities like energy audits, the lease and purchase of energy efficiency equipment, EV charging, and so on, that don't necessarily have a significant or potential for significant visual or physical effects. So in the Section 106 program comment draft, what we have in this category are only those activities, and it says right at the top, only those activities that either reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the building or that improve the climate resiliency of the building. So these are not blanket exceptions. They're really tailored to meeting the goals of our climate change and historic preservation policy statement. So thinking about the site work type activities, the installation of stormwater management through green infrastructure, the installation of utilities, those have caveats, especially with regard to ground disturbance, that limit when a federal agency can do them. But nonetheless, those activities are included with the caveats as the kinds of activities that the program comment will promote. There's also when it comes to exterior building exteriors. So we all know that there is a push for storm windows. We know, everything from storm windows and insulated doors to building control systems or energy meters that might have a little, thing on the side of a building. As long as those are not on the primary facades, the program comment says that federal agencies are allowed to do them, again, subject to some conditions. That's in the first half of the Climate Smart Buildings appendix. The second half says that with a qualified professional that says that this is not that reviews whether any activities, let's say on a primary facade, might affect historic fabric and says there are no adverse effects, then those items might proceed. An additional one that I know many of your communities are involved with are clean energy technologies. So again, in the first half of the program comment, we talk about clean energy technologies, and we really just mean solar. There's not a lot of other types of technologies that are mounted on the exterior of buildings, but where those are mounted in a way that is not on the primary facade or visible or is on previously disturbed ground, those have a pass for the federal agency. However, where they are visible, where they are on primary facades, there is also a track for federal agencies to pursue those types of projects. The reason that this could be a change from the way that some of your local commissions review solar panels. So, for example, you might have a blanket rule in your jurisdiction that says these can never be seen from the public right-of-way. I think there is a changing approach in preservation that says, listen, if these solar panels are removable without damaging historic fabric, why not keep them visible? And I know this from my experience at Preservation Connecticut, where we put highly visible solar panels on the roof of the Eli Whitney boarding house, which is a very historic site. If you know Eli Whitney, the inventor from Connecticut. And that's where the headquarters of the Preservation Connecticut is, in part because we wanted to make a statement that preservation and climate solutions can go hand in hand. And that was a board-wide decision, and it was pretty great to see those mounted and now providing a good chunk of the energy on that building. But I say that to just say, again, different local governments may have different approaches, and that may override what we're saying in the program comment, especially when it comes to private buildings. But I do think that preservationists are seeing this in a new light, and the better approach, at least in my view, is to try to show people how much we're part of the solution with our buildings, which are inherently greener because they're already built. The last point I think is a really important one, and it falls in the category of activities and building interiors. So thermal insulation is always a hot topic when it comes to Section 106 reviews. This program comment says that thermal insulation, as long as it's not spray foam, as long as it doesn't damage historic materials, is okay and even promoted, even if it increases the thickness of a building. And my main example here is an example that I know from my time in Hartford, where not only was I on the Historic Commission, but I also chaired the Planning and Zoning Commission for 7 years. So again, my local work is always weighing on me. And this is a building in Hartford in a neighborhood that is a Promise Zone designated neighborhood. It's 98% African American, and it's a gold leaf manufacturing facility that was rehabbed by a nonprofit for community use, including a library, a greenhouse, and this office space that you see here. But you'll notice in this photo that people are wearing jackets. This is winter in Connecticut. They're wearing jackets because a review process said that putting insulation on these interior walls would hide the historic masonry. While that is true, what has happened here is not only is the building more expensive to operate for the nonprofit, but the people who are using it are clearly not comfortable. They're wearing jackets indoors. I guess, again, for me, one of the things that as a federal agency we have to continue to do, and in fact, it's right there in the National Historic Preservation Act, is weigh the preservation values that we all hold dear, including the value to preserve each and every brick. And this is nice room to look at, but to weigh that against some of the other goals. And in this case, in the program comment, the thumb goes on the scale of making sure that our buildings are energy efficient. And this is a rule that would apply, again, to those types of thermal insulation that are not damaging to historic fabric. Finally, in the area of climate-friendly transportation, the program comment divides into ground surfaces, fixtures and equipment, vegetation and landscapes, bridges, and other activities like the designation of safe routes to schools. EV charging stations is also covered there as well. And here's another image from Chicago with the elevated L right in front of historic buildings it goes through. And examples of this, and again, these are illustrative. There's, of course, a lot more in the actual program comment, include that non-historic ground surfaces can at curbs, sidewalks, bulb outs, ramps, crosswalks, replacements of pavement for cool pavement or permeable pavement. Those activities can be done without further Section 106 review in places where there's already a right-of-way, essentially replacements of these things, or in the case of bulb outs, which are those extensions of the sidewalk that improve pedestrian safety. Again, installations within existing road right-of-way. Bike and micromobility parking racks to a certain height, benches, tables, planters, lights, and bus shelters with the small bus shelters. Pedestrian and transit bridges, if a qualified authority says there are no adverse effects. These are the kinds of things that we do see in existing program alternatives that have been adopted by states, but we don't see them in every state, and we don't see them consistently across jurisdictions. So you may have never seen one of these types of projects in your review. Some of the maybe bigger ones you might have seen, like a bus shelter. But for the most part, these projects in the climate-friendly transportation category are in most jurisdictions already subject to a streamlining process. So why, might you ask, did we bother including those in a program comment? Actually, I'm going to skip ahead to this slide, and then I'll go back to that slide. The idea for a program comment is to identify undertakings that can benefit from a clear and consistent review. So one benefit of this program comment is that for those federal agencies and others who are involved with these repetitive undertakings, federal agencies are always insulating buildings. They're always sprucing up their sidewalks. For those that create housing like HUD or the Department of Defense, they have a lot of housing. They're doing the kinds of things that we've talked about in the program comment again and again and again across projects on a daily basis. It's very difficult for them to administer a program or to train folks on the ground when they're subject to a whole bunch of different rules. So the program comment, from a practical standpoint, might be able to reduce administrative burdens and costs. Consistency across project types, be it housing, be it bike lanes, be it energy efficiency improvements, will also ensure that people who are on the ground see consistency in terms of outcomes. And we've picked the projects in the program comment from the types of projects that we have heard or we know through experience, through our SHPOs, through our federal agencies, do not have adverse effects on historic properties. We also know that there's a huge amount of current and pending federal investments, especially that greenhouse gas reduction fund. I've talked directly with several green banks, folks that have received funding. They didn't even know there was a 106 process. And now they're like, well, maybe we'll never make any investments in historic properties unless we really understand this. So this is attempting to help them with clear rules for the way that they will deploy their money, so historic buildings do not get shut out of those programs. I really do view that particular program and the Climate Smart Buildings Appendix as being critically important to make sure that historic properties get upgrades that they need and that we want for them to have. So for local governments, for certified local governments in particular, this does not change anything relevant to local ordinances. It says it right there in the language of the program comment. This has no effect on state, local, tribal, or other federal laws. The other thing that you might have noticed in part 4 of the main document, not the appendices, is that there's a provision that requires compensation for local consulting parties that might be asked to do certain types of reviews, survey work, or additional research and analysis. So this, for the first time, is a program comment that may result in compensation to those groups that you probably work with as commissioners on the ground, who might be providing a lot of free labor to federal agencies. This says that if they're asked to participate, or if they do participate, they will get compensation for certain types of activities. Again, I'd be very interested to know whether you actively consult on the matters that are listed in the program comment now. It's my understanding from our State Historic Preservation Office partners that you don't necessarily consistently consult on these because there are already lots of agreements in place that lay out clear rules. Again, there are lots of different agreements, but they may not have such a big local component, but I'd be interested to know your experience with the Section 106 process, because if it's not a big change to the volume that you review, or if we've exempted the kinds of activities that you've seen have adverse effects, then that's also very, very helpful to know. So just concluding here, inviting feedback. So today's discussion is one place where, we'll take notes and log your questions. And I know NAPC is going to be doing the same. I would also ask you, if you have additional comments in writing, to submit to the email address. And that public comment period will close by October 9th. I do see a couple of questions in the chat just about State Street. And so GSA, and just so thank you, I'll close there. But that funding, it's in the works as to how to repurpose it. So that's a story that's continuing onward. But at a minimum, they've confirmed as of yesterday that rehabilitation is the preferred alternative to demolition, and then there'll be a cascading series of effects on that funding. So anyway, with that aside, I'll close, and thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sarah. If we could put up the other slides real quick, I got one more. And then just as a quick reminder, if you haven't found the Q&A tab, you can click on that, leave a question. If you see a question you like and want, hopefully we get to answer, you can give it a little vote with a thumbs up, and that'll move it higher in the list. So just to reiterate, kind of, our position on this is we really want to speak to local outcomes and really local impacts. There's a lot of conversations going on with the SHPOs and other preservation partners, more generally about the program comments and some other suggestions. But we want to hear from you all, really kind of, again, as Sarah mentioned, how you all participate in Section 106 now, and what are some potential impacts that we aren't really anticipating with this draft. And then just kind of quickly to help frame the conversation, we have put together some initial comments. Again, we will be working in the next few weeks to finalize those, and do welcome your input to influence that. But by and large, I mean, a lot of the scopes that are outlined as being permitted through the program comment, we don't have a lot of concern with. A lot of them are minor, routine in nature. Many of them are already subject to program alternatives, either state by state basis, or even with some cities involved. Things like, and Sarah, I'll ask you to clarify, but I believe that building interiors, the things that are permitted through the comment, are specific to things that are not like primary or public spaces within interiors. So assembly spaces, lobbies, kind of those common areas, those would still be subject to Section 106.
So yes, and I can pull up the document and go through those, but in general, the main part, the A1, refers to those, and there's a lot of caveat language in there, but those activities that are taking place either outside of primary spaces or in buildings that are not historic, or not known to be historic. So that's, as you said, the bulk of the activities. There are some provisions in Part A2, Appendix A2, that would apply to certain primary spaces, certain activities in certain primary spaces, but that would be subject to a qualified professional weighing in on the impacts. So I'm happy to go through if you have a specific line that you wanted to look at.
No, I want to make sure we have time to get to the questions, but I just want to note that we are concerned about non-primary facades being exempt from Section 106, mostly because that would allow for things like replacement of materials, and it's really unknown, just because we all know at the local level, we have a variety of historic resources, be it districts or landmarks, that are all varied, and so the approach is varied, and so what is character defining, or what is significant that the structure is going to really be unique to the individual undertaking and the type of resource it is. And so there's just a lot of unknowns, and this is a new thing, and I think with any sort of new policy, there's just kind of that initial hurdle of like, okay, like, well, what is this going to look like in practice, and kind of understanding what the impacts are overall to the resources. It is, while many local commissions would not have purview over interiors, we have very little purview here in our city. I think that's common in most places, unless there's an exceptional property. We do have usually purview over the entire building exterior. Sometimes there is embedded flexibility in our design guidelines or standards for those non-primary or less visible facades. But it always sends that message that, okay, well, if the federal government isn't reviewing this, then what is the local role? And I think we know legally there's no real conflict, but again, it's just sort of that perception that that local policy should follow the federal policy that's in place. There's one kind of broader question again. You mentioned qualified professionals that would be sort of determining the applicability of the program comment, and what scopes are subject versus not. And so, in those cases where either the SHPO isn't engaged or there's no notice because it does fall in the program comment, there's a little bit of concern over who that decision maker is, what went into the decision, because otherwise there would be really no practical notification as to the undertaking or a chance to identify or disagree with some of the determinations. And so I'll let you respond to that quickly if you'd like to, and then I will ask Abby to join us again and facilitate our Q&A.
Great. Yeah. I mean, so all of that, there's a lot of thoughts there. I do think it's really important to reiterate, though, that the local scope is not affected. So I don't know of a local, a local commission that maybe they're out there, but that feels like, well, if one authority has said X, then we have to go with that, even if it's a federal authority. So, I would encourage you to exercise your own legal authority as it's written out in your own ordinances, and do what you have to do, just like we're doing what we feel like we have to do. Great.
That's definitely true. And I don't think we're the ones saying that. I think usually it's the developer that's saying it. So again, I think we're accustomed to that kind of pressure and sort of defending our own regulations and our own policies. But this is something that even happens now, which is like a simple tax credit review. There's not always agreement between the local outcome and the state and federal reviewer outcomes. And so, that puts the developer or the project kind of in the middle, and we usually have to negotiate those outcomes. Okay, Abby?
Okay, we have quite a few questions here, so we'll see how many we have time for. First up, kind of just a technical question. How will the primary facade, how will that term be defined? How is it going to be, buildings that may have, kind of multiple visible facades, like buildings on corners or tall enough that more than one side is visible? How is that going to be defined in the program comment?
Yep. So it's on page about 18 of the program comment, if you're on the link in the definition section, and they should be in alphabetical order, hopefully. But it's under primary facade, and I'll just read it for folks who didn't get a chance. The exterior facade of a building, and this is from the Park Service guidance, by the way, the exterior facade of a building, which serves as the front or major entry point of the building. So that's the typical, but it also says, provided that a determination of the primary facade depends on a variety of factors, and one building may have more than one primary facade. And we've also been suggested to add to that definition, or even have all facades as primary facades. So the comment period is ongoing, but we have gotten some comments on primary facades, and I think we'll take a look at those. And like I said, one of them has been that it's possible for all facades to be primary facades, and we can all think of examples of buildings on that.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification. Okay, next up, we have one that's related to the Secretary of Interior standards. It says, it appears to me from your prior work and policy statements that the real issue is interpretation of the Secretary of the Interior standards. Is this program comment your way of trying to get around projects being reviewed with those? And instead, could we just look at improving the interpretation of the Secretary of the Interior standards?
So thanks for that question. And I'm happy to drop in the chat when I get a chance a report that I issued to our council members on the Secretary standards based on past reports on them, based on feedback from 300 pages of comments that we received, probably from some of you in this room, about the challenges of consistency with the Secretary standards, including the way that they might interpret housing. They might be interpreted at all levels of government to address housing or climate resilience or mitigation proposals. So, I mean, there's no secret from my perspective on that. I assembled all this research and comments and presented it to the council. But ACHP is an independent federal agency, and we have no say over the Department of the Interior or the Park Service. We can only advise. That's in our title. That's what we do as an agency. We advise, and then we regulate through 106. And I think that conversation in DC on the standards is ongoing. And I'm hopeful that more voices will continue to raise, again, just really the issues about consistency and interpretation, and what should we be asking project proponents to do, and what do the standards require? Because, as you know, they're pretty broad. I would not say that this program comment is a workaround so much as it is an attempt to achieve, the goals of clarity, consistency, and also to use the knowledge that we have amassed across agreements, across tens of thousands of undertakings just like these. As Corey said, a lot of them are the routine stuff that hopefully will not have adverse effects and have proven not to have adverse effects in prior projects. So we're trying to use this to provide greater clarity and consistency for those types of projects that we have heard from the preservation community are top priority projects: housing conversions and rehabs, climate resilience measures, energy efficiency measures, renewable energy. And this is a very small, because it's only building related renewable energy, but it's a step towards the clean energy dimension approach. So that's the goal. I mean, it's not trying to circumvent. Nothing we say in this, has any effect on the Department of the Interior's interpretations of their standards and how they go about that process. But it's presenting, again, with the goals in mind, a perspective on how our process, which is the federal regulatory process that we are tasked by Congress to administer, should proceed in projects involving these undertakings.
Okay, thanks. Okay, next up, we have a question. Why is a historic preservation agency advocating for the destruction of historic windows? The most efficient windows are historic ones with either wooden storms or interior windows. Besides authenticity, horrible for the environment to add to landfills and take resources out of the environment to make new ones and have, spew carbon in the production process.
So I appreciate that comment. And of course, we, as preservationists across the board, windows are probably one of the topics that we talk about most at the Historic Commission level. Windows and exterior building materials, but windows are a big one because they are the eyes of the building, right? So they're there to communicate, about a building's historic significance. I would not say that the federal agency is advocating anything in this program comment. We're setting out a proposal for a regulatory process. And I'll also say that for the issue of windows, I encourage you to check out, again, the two appendices. The first two are really going to be the most relevant. Windows, as they relate to housing, are covered in both A1 and A2. You can do a control find for windows. And what we say about windows in Appendix 1, for example, is that windows on a building less than 45 years old and not known after a records check to be a historic property, on a building that has been determined not to be a historic property, or on the non-primary facade of a historic building or a building whose eligibility for inclusion is not known. Those are the circumstances in which windows can be touched under this program comment. There's more on windows in Appendix A2, again, as well as B1 and B2, the two climate smart building appendices. But we're also really careful to say very explicitly, caulking, weather stripping, reglazing, and so on are also promoted both in Appendix A1 as well as in the Appendix B1 on climate smart buildings. So there is not only language about where these windows, at least in the first appendix, might be located and what types of buildings they can be located on if they're covered by that, but also specific provisions promoting the maintenance of existing windows. The reality, that we know is that storm windows can be either interior or exterior, a good solution for keeping those historic windows, but also making a building energy efficient. So storm windows are one of those things that are advanced by this program comment as a valid treatment, again, in the appropriate locations that I just listed.
Thanks. Okay, next up we have a question. Well, we have two questions that are related to the qualified authority that's going to be doing reviews. So one question asking, how's that going to be defined? Is the qualified authority going to be a Secretary of the Interior standards professionally qualified person, a SHPO, CLG official, or another consulting party? And then we also have somebody asking, with these qualified authorities, will they be required that their qualification is relevant to the subject? such as not having archaeologists reviewing visual effects to buildings?
Yes, so those are great questions. So there's I put in the chat the definition of qualified authority. It means a qualified professional or person, a qualified professional, which is the SOI definition, and that's another defined term. Or it means a person recognized by a relevant Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization to have expertise in identifying, evaluating, basically conducting historic preservation analysis. And they're recognized for that by their tribe or group of Native Hawaiians. So the reason we use the phrase qualified authority, not everywhere, but in many instances in the program comment, is because we as an agency, separately from the other two policy statements, have adopted a policy statement on Indigenous knowledge and historic preservation. And like these two policy statements called on us to review program alternatives in the 106 process for housing and climate, that policy statement said we need to work on integrating Indigenous knowledge into the Section 106 process. That's why you see that definition here. We have already received comments asking for a SHPO to be additionally listed in the list of qualified authorities and maybe others. So I'll take this as a CLG, a recommendation for a CLG type professional. All of those comments, very welcome. So it could be that you see some changes to the definition of qualified authority. I will just say, though, that your question, what was the other question? The question was about,
Will it be relevant? Do they have to have qualifications that are related to the review being done?
Yep, absolutely. So if you look at section, it's in section 3C, and it explicitly says, and I'll include that in the chat, when a federal agency chooses to use a qualified professional, it has to be somebody who's relevant and appropriate to the circumstances. So this is in section 3C, and it explicitly says that the qualified authority needs to be a qualified professional with architectural expertise if we're talking about a building. If we're talking about a tribal site, it's got to be one of the members, one of the people who have expertise recognized by their tribe. So that is definitely in there. And that's new language that we've never, I don't know that we've ever used in a program comment like this.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. So love to wrap up if you just could explain to everyone, we know when the comment when the deadline is for comments, what's the process after that? So what, any final comments you want to make, and what's the process moving forward for these?
Great. Yeah. So the current program public comment period ends on October 9th. And as you may have just heard me in regurgitating comments we've already received, I read directly every single comment that comes in. So when you send something in, it gets uploaded. As soon as it gets uploaded, I read it. I know that our staff is diligently working to read and sift through everything as well. So we're hoping to see robust engagement on these issues. And so very much looking forward to comments and experience from local commissioners. In general, I view this program comment as a way for us to use our authorities as a federal agency to proactively address some of the things that preservationists have gotten attacked for as preservationists in a way that actually promotes historic preservation. In my view, if we continue to say how we as preservationists want preservation to happen and we facilitate these types of activities, we are doing ourselves a huge favor, and we're doing our communities a huge favor, because we are giving people a clear path to rehabilitating historic buildings and adding amenities to existing historic neighborhoods. So I really view this as a pro-preservation document, again, because we are ourselves as preservationists saying, here are the rules of the game. Here's where we can facilitate these activities. In other places, hold off. We need more consultation. That's not included. But for these types of activities, we're going to give you the rules, and you go follow them, and you'll know that you can produce the housing, you can make the buildings resilient, you can add amenities transportation-wise to your communities. And so I really do encourage you to view this as preservationists and to say, is this what we, does this balancing work? Because it's just a draft and it's really here for your comments. So again, really appreciate appreciate all the engagement in the chat as well, and looking forward to more from everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And thanks to everyone who attended. Encourage everyone to read the comments and to send feedback. So this is it for today, but we will be back with our regular monthly webinars starting next month.
Thank you so much, Abby, for having me.
Sure.
See you
Thanks so
guys
much.
soon.
Thank you.